I'm Dr. Stephen Andrew Missick, and in this program I'm going to talk about exploring Jewish Christianity, ancient Jewish Christianity, from ancient sources. So, I think throughout church history, there's been various movements or attempts or interests in reconnecting with the Jewish roots of the faith. So it's not a new phenomenon. Like, I believe in the 1800s you had Alfred Edersheim. In the 1800s you had a lot of books written by Albert Edersheim, The Messiah and other works, where he was raised from a Jewish background, did an in-depth study of Judaism, and then tried to inform his understanding of Jesus and that of the general Christian religious reading public of the Jewish cultural background of Jesus. Wrote his book on the temple, or this book on Jesus called the Messiah. So back in the probably Jesus Revolution movement, we saw the rise of Jews for Jesus and the Messianic movement. So you have Messianic Jews, which are people who believe that Yeshua, or Jesus, is the Messiah, trying to connect to the Jewish cultural background. Yeshua, all right? That's the way you say Jesus. So you have Moshe Rose, and you have others now. You had Zola Levitt, but the people, Jewish believers. And you also see a movement to try to change vocabulary, to reimagine or rethink who Jesus is. And, for instance, we have the name James, which is Jacob. It's like, how did you get James out of Jacob? The etymology. But, when you think of the name Jacob, you got more of a connection to the Jewish name. The Latin form, the English form, is removed from that. So using using Hebrew terms instead of our Latinized or Hellenized vocabulary also helps us to reconnect with the original Jewish culture of Jesus. So you have Hebraic Christians, and what they want to do as well is let's reconnect with go back to the original source. Let's go beyond the Greco-Roman traditions and go back to the original Hebrew and Aramaic culture that Jesus belonged to. But when we're doing this, I think we need to acknowledge the importance of Greek. I'll give you an example. The word synagogue. It's a Greek word. It just shows at that period of history and antiquity, the Greek culture and language had an influence in Judaism, so much so that we use the word synagogue, a Greek word. And important literature that helps us understand the Jewish context is written in Greek. Josephus, Philo of Alexandria. These are Jewish thinkers and writers who are writing in Greek. And we also have the Jewish-produced Septuagint Bible, which had books that aren't part of the New Testament, the Old Testament canon for most Protestant Christians. But Jews at the time of Jesus used these extra books, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, Jesus Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, and others. And that literature, although written in Greek, is profoundly important. So when you had this Messianic movement, people want to express Christianity in a Jewish cultural mode, right? To worship using Jewish modes of worship. So one of the ways they would do this is take a Seder or a Jewish prayer book and just insert Yeshua or alter it or add it to bring Jesus into it. Now this is not a new phenomenon. This is the 2-volume set of Old Testament pseudepigrapha. And this is ancient Jewish literature from the time of Jesus. It's mostly preserved by Christians. And in here, we have Jewish synagogue prayers that says Hellenistic synagogal prayers, where this is the liturgy, going back to the time of Jesus, that was used in the synagogues, but in Greek. And some Christians just took the Jewish synagogue liturgy and Christianized it. Probably Jewish Christians did this. So it's been preserved to this day. And scholars looking at this text realize, hey, this is the synagogue liturgy. I mean, they added Jesus into it. So this isn't a new phenomenon, taking the Jewish prayer book and let's insert Jesus here and there, Holy Spirit, Christian terminology, but using Hebrew and Aramaic to do it. Incorporate the traditional Jewish religious practices and traditional prayers and orders of worship, and just inserting Jesus in it. Another thing that some people do, is consult the rabbis. And this is kind of problematic. It's like, when do these rabbis write? Like somebody like Rashi, believed to live in the 1100s, if I remember correctly. These rabbis, European rabbis, living 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. Different historical context, different culture. They have a different language background, totally different historical context. So we should be careful about that. Now, what's his name? Geshe Verms, I think his name was. He's passed away. He's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. But we have other Jewish literature that's significant. One would be the Targums. What are the Targums? Aramaic sort of displaced Hebrew as the spoken language of Jews, or for many Jewish people. So the Old Testament needed to be translated into Aramaic, from Hebrew into Aramaic. And the Targums are Aramaic translations of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in Aramaic. And this shows that some of these are very ancient, and they show us how, because these aren't just straightforward word-for-word translations, they're interpretive translations, they're paraphrases. And they show us how Jews interpreted and understood the Bible in mostly late antiquity. And then you also have the Mishnah, and the commentary on the Mishnah, the Gemara, which is known as the Talmud. So, the issue here with the Mishnah, especially, and this is believed to be the oral law passed down by word of mouth, and then finally written down by Rabbi Judah the Prince, Hanasi, in 200 AD. So, this is like over 150 years after the time of Jesus, the time of Yeshua. So that's a lot of time for traditions to develop, right? And some scholars say, well, even though it's written in 200, it contains much older traditions. Maybe it does, but we need to remember that this is written 100 and over 160 years after the time of Jesus and the apostles. Over 100 years after the temple was destroyed. These traditions are confined to writing. Are they dependable? Do they accurately reflect the time of Jesus? Maybe, maybe not. I think you have to have a little bit of some reservations. Also, there are some targums were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but most of these targums we have are from a much later date. So we use this literature. We just understand that it's not contemporary. with Jesus and the apostles. It's a little later. We should always bear that in mind when we consult these texts when they were written. So, we have this phenomenon, Messianic Judaism. Let's renew Christianity by reconnecting with the Jewish origins of the faith. And how are we going to do that? We're going to incorporate prayers and traditions from modern day Judaism, which go back much later. So you're Christianizing, in a sense, for lack of a better word, traditional rabbinic Judaism and their prayers and traditions and practices. Let's just incorporate belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Now, the New Testament is Jewish, right? I mean, we see this overtly in certain books. The Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, the Epistle of the Hebrews. So, plus, this is from the first century. What about other contemporary literature? We talked about Philo and Josephus already. Those books are written in Greek, as is the text of the New Testament we have. There are some. I mean, the Hebrew Matthews we have come from a much later date. We have the Bible in Aramaic. It's valuable, but scholars look at it and believe that those are translations. Jesus spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek. If there were Aramaic Gospels, there are, but they seem to be translations from the Greek. So Jesus speaks Aramaic, Gospels are written in Greek, and the Aramaic Bibles we have, I'm not saying they're not valuable, they are. But they're translated back in the original language from Greek. Right? So the New Testament manuscripts we... Now, scholars, when they're translating the New Testament, they consult different traditions. These are the Syriac or the Aramaic Bibles are an important witness to the text of the New Testament, and Bible translators do consult them when they're translating from the Greek. But the New Testament is in Greek. I'm not saying that the Aramaic versions aren't important. They are. So a lot of the sources we have. And then we have also, as I mentioned, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran Scrolls, right? And what do we have from Qumran? Well, we got biblical manuscripts in Hebrew and Aramaic. And then we have sectarian literature. Actually, if I was going to do this in a better order, we have biblical manuscripts, then we have so-called apocryphal texts, like the Book of Enoch, for example, and Tobit, and other, the Genesis. They got the paraphrase of the Genesis in there. It's very interesting. It's in Aramaic. So you got biblical manuscripts and apocryphal texts. Some of these apocryphal texts were considered by the Qumran community to be the Bible, or part of the Bible. Sectarian literature. So there's this community that produced scrolls found in Qumran. This community called themselves the Yahad. Scholars speculate that they were the Essenes, which is a sect of monks, basically, Jewish monks from the time of Jesus. And this is their monastic order, basically, in other writings. And with biblical manuscripts, you also have, not that many, but there's also, we talked about the Greek Septuagint. We have some manuscripts, the Greek Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The majority of the scrolls are in Hebrew. Many of them are in Aramaic. Very few are in Greek, but all three languages are represented: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So, when I studied in college history, it's like you want to go back to if you're a historian, you want to go back the oldest accounts you can find, right? You want primary sources. So, what I'm saying is, like, when we study Jewish literature, right, or the Jewish origins of Christianity, right, there were sects of Judaism the Ebionites. This is a in what's today Jordan and as far north as what's today Aleppo, you had these Ebionite Christians. Ebion means the poor. It's from a Hebrew word. And this was a sect of Jewish Christians. And the early church fathers encountered them. And they had a significant presence, probably all the way until the rise of Islam. So when Islam came to dominate and conquer lands, eventually these Ebionite Christian communities disappeared. I mean, look at how, like in Syria today, there used to be, Syria went from being, before the Syrian Civil War, it's over like 12% Christian. Now they say it's like 3%. So that's today. And all of these lands used to be Christian. So if the Greek Orthodox, or Roman Orthodox they call it, if the Orthodox and Catholic Christians in the Middle East have been reduced to a small minority, like the Coptic Christians in Egypt and other ones, what about an even smaller sect like the Ebionites? They disappeared over 1,000 years ago. But they produced literature that has survived, that gives us a perspective on a sect of Judaism, of Messianic Christian Jews, Jewish Christians, right? An ancient sect of Jewish Christians whose origins go back to the 1st century. So, if you're exploring the Jewish roots of the faith, right? And if you want to reconnect with it in some way, or revitalize or renew Christianity through its original Jewish cultural context, historical context, instead of consulting much later sources like rabbinic traditions of someone like Rashi, and even something like the Talmud, which documents which aren't accepting of Jesus the Messiah, right? What about a sect of Judaism that did acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah? And imagine if we could find, you can imagine if, a discovery, right? Discovery, if archaeologists found a cave outside of Aleppo, for instance. I've been to Aleppo a few times. Let's just imagine was a modern bustling metropolis, had a large Christian community in it too. It's so sad to have seen these places and then destruction just waged against them in such a terrible way. But back to the story. Let's just imagine. Okay, let's just imagine a scenario. I'm in Aleppo, and I went from Aleppo to they call it Kalat Saman, the old monasteries and ruins of Saint Simon Stylites. Let's just say while I was wandering around there, I found a cave and went into the cave, and I found a hoard of ancient manuscripts written by the Ebionite Christians. It's like, could you imagine how sensational that discovery would be? That someone's found like a Dead Sea Scroll type discovery, literature written by the Ebionite Christians. That'd be sensational, right? That this literature has survived to this day, and there'd be a lot of interest in it. And people would use that as a valuable resource to understand the Jewish roots of the faith, right? Well, we have, interestingly enough, we have a significant amount of literature written by Ebionite Christians that has survived to this day. It's called the pseudo-Clementine literature. So it's kind of these writings are kind of intimidating in a way. It's long. Not only do we have writings, or a writing, preserved this day, written by the Ebionite sect of Jewish Christianity, it's substantial in length. It's not just a little tiny little book. It's actually kind of a novel. And what happened? Now the Ebionites used to have their gospel, right? The gospel of the Ebionites. It's quoted from a lot by the early church fathers. We have, if you take all their quotations together, I don't know, 4 or 5 pages, maybe less than that. Maybe 1 page front and back, maybe 2 maximum. So the Gospel of the Ebionites, and it seems to be very similar to the book of Matthew. It has some differences, which are noted by the early church fathers, but there's probably a lot more differences and a lot more additional information that wasn't preserved. So, I mean, if it wasn't for the rise of Islam, we might still have access to this literature, but a lot of information from the ancient world and from the early church period that was preserved for a long time vanished. But the Pseudo-Clementine literature, which is the Recognitions of Clement and the Homilies of Clement, and these are 2 different adaptations of a lost book. The Acts of the Apostles, focusing on Peter. I mean, really, the Acts of the Apostles we have focuses mostly on, in the beginning it focuses on Peter, then it switches over to Paul. It's basically the book of Acts in our Bibles is a biography of Paul. Now, I love Paul. Right? I think he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, very wise, profound thinker. But the Ebionites didn't like Paul too much. So, and that kind of comes across in a few places in the Pseudo-Clementine literature. So, why is the Pseudo-Clementine literature? I need to explain a little bit more about what it is, but why is it important? Sadly, I wish I read it a long time ago. I've only recently read the Clementine literature. The reason why, because you look at it, it's like, I'm always reading through books. I'm a reader. But to me, it looked like reading War and Peace, right? It's a daunting challenge because it's not a short book. It's a big book, and it's going to be an investment to read that. Maybe it's like, I don't like Stephen King. I'm not a big fan of him, but he has this book, The Stand. It looks like it's the Holy Bible, right? When you tackle a book like that, you have to commit to read it, It's like, wow. I mean, I'm a serious reader, but I mean, you see a big, giant tome like that, it's a little bit intimidating, honestly. And it's going to be a challenge to read it. So, how I started tackling this is we have the Aramaic version, the Syriac Pseudo-Clement. By Stanley. But first off, I tackled the Pseudo-Clementine literature a long time ago because there's a story of a dialogue or debate in the temple. It's called the Ascents of James. So, the brother of Jesus. One of the church fathers, Epiphanius, is that his name? He was a heresy hunter, and he writes about the Ebionites. And he mentions they used a book called The Ascents of James. And scholars speculate that a section of the Clementine Recognitions is the author just stuck The Ascents of James in there, just quoted the entire book in it. So I think some scholars debate that. Is this the actual Ascents of James? It seems to be. There's the book I put together of it because I want to make this information available to the general public. That's the problem with the Clementine literature. It's so, like I said, it's a thick book. it's not accessible to the general reading public right now. So, I'll have to explain what the pseudo-Clementine homilies are, and then I'll talk about how you can read it today. So, I'll talk about Stanley's book in just a moment. So this is what scholars are saying now. You have the ascents of James. Let's just say that the ascents of James, when is it dated from? Close to the year 100, maybe the year 135, if this scholarly opinion is correct, or earlier, right? Probably the latest 135. So this is based on what they're debating and arguing, I would say it's close to 100. Because you have the followers of John the Baptist, the Sadducees, each one of these different sects, the Samaritans, they debate each of the 12 apostles. And some of these sects weren't really influential, large, or significant after the year 100. So why would you write about these sects that have fallen into decline? And especially the way the debates are written, it's like they're tackling relevant, contemporary, important issues. So the temple debate, which is most likely the same thing as the ascents of James, around the year 100. And it's incorporated into the incorporated into the Clementine literature. And then we have the Pergamata Petra, or the teaching of Peter. This is dated to around the year 150. And both of these books are Ebionite. Right? This is Ebionite literature. And there's probably other. So you have, I'll just call it didactic material. Teachings, probably from the 1 in 200s of the Ebionites, doctrinal statements, dialogues, written by Ebionite Jewish Christians. So around the year 150 to 200, maybe to 220 be better. This is when the apocryphal Acts appear. So you have the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of John, and there's actually 5 of them. We also have the Acts of Andrew. There's also Acts of Thomas, that's the 5th one. And then there's also Acts of Philip. It probably belongs, these are all date from the middle of the 2nd century to the turn of the 2nd. To turn of the 3rd. Acts of Paul, Acts of Peter, Acts of John, Acts of Andrew, Acts of Thomas, and Acts of Philip. So, I was talking to, just thinking about these things, right? You're reading, engaging the text, literature. There are exceptions. Now, in the 1st century, the Jewish writers in the New Testament are very concerned with Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled by Jesus. But when these Acts are being written, it could just be the context of them, because most of the time these apostles are preaching to a Gentile audience. So they're not appealing to the Scriptures, they're not appealing to prophecy so much. Now, in the Abdias book, you have the Acts of James, the son of Zebedee, James the brother of John. It does have a sermon where he's debating with the Jews, he's appealing to Old Testament prophecy. But that's not really seen too much in these Acts. That shows the difference between what the apostles are writing, the 1st century Jewish Christians are writing, and then what's being written, But the important things about these texts, especially the Acts of Paul, especially the Acts of Paul and the Acts of John, the Acts of Peter as well, is these texts are based, probably Acts of Andrew, these texts are based on oral tradition. Someone's grandfather or father knew or saw Peter as a child or was told about him. And the author, especially the Acts of Paul, the author collected oral traditions. He visited these communities. Oh yeah, my grandfather, my dad knew Paul, and this is what he told me. So he's incorporating. Now that's significant. These are stories passed down, oral traditions, from the middle of the 2nd century. Historical memories, oral traditions collected in the Acts of Paul. So these are Gentile Christians, really, for the most part, writing these Acts of the Apostles. So around the same time when these apocryphal Acts are being written, the Pergamata Petro, the preaching of Peter, is written by an Ebionite Christian. It's their version. So you have these Gentiles' Acts of these Apostles, and then we have a Jewish Christian writing his account. So the next century, an Ebionite Christian, he decides to write a life of Peter, or a segment of, a section, part of Peter's life. And when he does this, he's going to write it from the perspective of Clement of Rome. We have a writing, at least. We have First Clement, which scholars agree. I haven't heard anybody saying Clement did not write. In the year 95 A.D., Clement, according to strong tradition, it's historical, Clement was a disciple of Peter. I think that's established fact. And we have an epistle written by Clement. So this Ebionite Christian decides to write a portion or part of Peter's life from the perspective of Clement, as if Clement is telling the story of meeting Peter and being converted, hearing the preaching of the gospel. But this is a Jewish Christian account of the life of Peter from a Jewish Christian perspective, that of the Ebionites. So this person who's going to write this book, which we should probably call it the Travels or Journey of Peter, but I think scholars used to call it the Circuits. We usually use the word circuits now for electronics, how we use our language. The Circuits of Peter, right? But probably using modern, how English is used, we should call this book the Travels of Peter, or the Journeys of Peter, right? So, let's see what happens next. This is interesting. What happened next? So you have this Jewish Christian life of Peter. We're going to call it the Journey of Peter, the Journeys of Peter, right? The Journeys of Peter. Now, two different writers decide to make adaptations, their own version of this Journeys of Peter, right? They rearrange material different ways. And one is called the Recognitions of Clement. This is a version. Some author decides, I'm going to create my own version of this book, the Journeys of Peter. I'm just going to redo this book my own way. An adaptation, right? Probably the way I think about this would be like, let's take a movie. Pride and Prejudice, right? Imagine a world where, well, let me finish the other adaptation really quick, and then we'll talk about it. The next one's called the Homilies of Clement. Now, these are different retellings of the story of the Journeys of Peter. And there are certain places where these two versions or adaptations of this book are similar word for word, but they're structured different. There's certain details in one book that's not in the others. Certain of the events are moved around by these different authors. I think that the Recognitions of Clement probably reflects the Journeys of Peter more accurately, but then there's a lot of information in the Homilies of Clement which is not found. The writer, or the rewriter, the person that adapted the Journeys of Peter and the Recognitions of Clement, left out a lot of information that the author of the Homilies of Clement kept in his account. So you got different accounts of this one book. So what happens is these two books, which overlap and are obviously derived from this book, become popular and are preserved. And the original book from which they are derived and based on disappears. So probably scholars can look at these two books, how they're similar, how they're different, and theoretically reconstruct the original lost work, which doesn't exist anymore. So, a modern day example of how this worked, right? I think maybe TV adaptations. Imagine, let's say there's a nuclear war, right? Movies are preserved. So we have Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the miniseries, and then a feature film adaptation, whatever, you know. Was it Colin Firth is in a mini? I think I saw one Pride and Prejudice on my things. But anyway, it's just an example. It's a popular book among women, and so it's been adapted to television and film several times. So imagine that there's the Keira Knightley version, the Colin Firth version, right? One's a TV miniseries, one's a feature film. Imagine a world, say there's a big war, and Pride and Prejudice doesn't exist anymore, and all you have is these two movies, which are derived from the same book, but tell the same story in different ways. That's what you have in these two accounts here. Or, say for instance, we had the 1984 Dune movie, and then we had Dune Part 1 and Part 2. You know, the stories are told in those two movies. It's the same story, and there's a lot of, it's the same plot, so there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of profound differences in how those two stories were adapted. We see the same thing right here. So obviously I'm going to have to talk about this more. This is a very long and deep subject, and these two books are very, very long. I wonder, this would probably be, I need to get a copy of, I'm reading my version, it's from the early Church Fathers, one of the many volumes of the series of the Church Fathers, like an Encyclopedia Britannica set. It's probably, maybe that, I don't know, I don't know if it's quite as long as this book, but I would say it's at least that thick. That's the Recognitions and the, so it'd be like that. This would be the Recognitions, half of that, and the other one would be the Homilies. Now, Rufinus, a church father and a contemporary of St. Jerome, produced a translation of the Recognitions of Clement. And it's obviously it's a Jewish Christian in its origin and perspective, but there is not any deviant theology in it. There's nothing that different from biblical Christianity in the Recognitions of Clement. Now, the Homilies of Clement is a little different. You have the idea. Now, these Ebionite Jewish Christians are the Torah observant, but there are certain things in the Torah they think that they believed, at least some of the Ebionites believed, that the proper way to understand the Torah, they thought certain sections were not inerrant. The proper way to understand the Torah from their point of view was through the true prophet. So Jesus is the true prophet. And most of the quotations, which isn't too surprising, most of the quotations of the Gospels and the Clementine literature, the pseudo-Clementine literature as it's called, is from the Gospel of Matthew. And when they quote from like Luke or John, I kind of wonder that if they're not quoting from the Gospel of the Ebionites, because some of these traditions that we found could have been passed around orally or just accepted in their tradition. Or maybe they added parts of the Gospel of John to their gospel. But Jesus is the true prophet. There's not really a lot of focus on the death of Jesus, the atoning death, but they place a lot of focus on baptism, repentance, conversion, and baptism. And baptism is efficacious for conversion, necessary for salvation. And in the New Testament, there's certain controversies. Like in the book of Galatians, Paul rebukes Peter for not having table fellowship with Gentiles. That the Ebionite Christians did not believe that Jews and Gentiles, because of kosher regulations, should not eat together. That's just their belief, which is in there. And also food sacrificed to idols. That's in the New Testament. Don't eat food sacrificed to idols because you're participating in pagan rituals by eating that. And some of the Ebionite Christians were actually vegetarian. They also rejected the animal sacrifice system. They believed that that was just a concession, that God didn't, that from the hardness of people's hearts, that God gave them the sacrificial system. Of course, Jesus' sacrifice, don't believe in the necessity of animals. That was temple worship was centered around. So that's one of the things. No animal sacrifice. Now, a lot of the beliefs which we see reflected in these texts, I don't think that's really a big issue, is a lot of the theology in the Clementine literature would just be general biblical theology, things that we would agree with, and that's them going against Gnosticism. Another thing that they believed is they believed in spiritual warfare, and they believed in heaven and hell, and the immortality of the soul. So it's like there's demonic spirits out there, the devil's active in the world, be careful, you could fall in the hands of Satan. That's spiritual warfare. That's something that's written about in here. So they believed in that, right? And why is heaven and hell and the immortal soul important? Because you have certain restorationist sects. Like, I'll give you an example. Like some Messianic. This is a restorationist sects, right? So, what does that mean? Joseph Smith of the Mormons claimed to be a restorationist. He says, well, Christianity is lost. The knowledge of true and authentic Christianity is lost. So Joseph Smith says, I've come to, an angel came to me and I'm going to reestablish authentic Christianity. It's been lost. The Jehovah's Witnesses are another example of that. We're going to restore Christianity actually because none of the churches or denomination are correct. We're going to restore Christianity to its original Jewish connections, biblical connections. And with the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists, like, okay, let's observe the Sabbath the way the early Jewish believers did. And especially with the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have the same origin. You had the Millerite movement in 1844, right? Millerite was a Bible prophecy teacher who's preaching the imminent return of the Lord. And Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists developed out of the Millerite movement. I think it's pretty obvious, and plus they have a lot of similarities. They have a lot of similarities because they have the same origins. And one of the things that they teach is cessation. They believe that when you're dead, you're dead. There is no immortal soul that human beings have. Sometimes they can describe this as soul sleep, right? That's what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. That's what the Seventh-day Adventists teach, that when you die, it's over. You cease to exist until the resurrection. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. And they appeal to certain Old Testament scriptures, like in the book of Psalms. Do the dead praise the Lord? They don't. If I want to praise the Lord, I'm going to praise the Lord now. So it's based on misunderstanding of certain, not understanding the context of those scriptures, not understanding the actual understanding or beliefs of the ancient in the nature of the afterworld. So, soul sleep, right? But these Ebionite Christians did not believe in soul sleep. They believe that if you sin and live a sinful life, that you're going to go to hell. You can be saved by trusting in Jesus, as accepting Jesus as the true prophet and being baptized. That's how they would put it. Then you're saved. Your sins are forgiven by trusting in the true prophet. You should accept Jesus as the true prophet. That's how they put it. And sometimes they didn't even use the name Jesus too much. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they talk about the crucifixion, but mostly it's our prophet, the true prophet. That's how they spoke of Jesus in the Clementine literature. That's how Peter and Clement speak of him most of the time. But you accept the true prophet, you accept baptism in his name, actually in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, they believe in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Like I said, the recognitions of Clement is orthodox in its theology, right? And that could have been because that I don't think Rufinus made that many changes. He might have changed a verse or two there, here and there. I think he's relatively faithful, and he admits it in his introduction. He says there's a certain section I didn't understand, I was confused, so I omitted it. And basically that section was saying that there's one God, the Father, and Jesus is divine, but he doesn't share in he's not the fullness of God. That's heresy, right? So they use a Trinitarian formula, but they believe that Jesus is begotten of the Father and not co-substantial as defined in the Council of Nicaea. I think that's heretical, but when the early it's kind of funny. If you read Eusebius or someone, they go, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's go visit these early it's contemporary to them." So Eusebius goes to Syria. He's going to visit with Ebionite Christians, and there's different sects of Ebionite Christians. Some of them, are more Jewish than Christian from their point of view, and some of them, even though they're very Jewish, they agree on the essentials of the faith, except they didn't like Paul. They did not like Paul. So, and by the way, we got Simon the Sorcerer. So, what you have in this, you have a story of Clement and his family, which I'm not going to get into this debate. This discussion. I'll have to do it later. But especially with both of them, you have debates between Simon Peter and Simon the Sorcerer. And Simon represents apostolic tradition from a Jewish Christian perspective, from maybe not Christian perspective. And Simon the Sorcerer is a Gnostic. He's a heretic. So Simon Peter is... Some scholars think that Simon the Sorcerer actually represents Paul the Apostle. There's only a couple of places where that's probably true. Usually Simon the Sorcerer represents Simon the Sorcerer, this Gnostic leader and heretic. There are a couple of places where the author is making a subtle dig at Paul, using Simon the Sorcerer as a stand-in for Paul. But most of the time, Simon the Sorcerer is not Paul. He's Simon the Sorcerer. But I have to concede there's a couple of places where they're attacking Paul through Simon the Sorcerer. The Ebionites are. So it's kind of complicated. I'll have to talk about that in another lecture. So these are some of the themes that we have in this Jewish Christian literature. So, like I said, they are, Torah observant, but they have their own mode they have their own Torah jurisprudence, right? This is not rabbinical interpretation of the Torah. This is a certain sect of Ebionite Christians' interpretation and practice of the Torah, right? So you have a unique Jewish Christian or Ebionite way of interpreting the Torah. Their own saying, we observe, like these Ebionite Christians, we observe the Torah, but we observe it through the interpretation of our true prophet. He is the interpreter of the Torah. So, it's a basic introduction. What do I want to talk about in conclusions, like how you can read the pseudo-Clementine literature. So I did excise the Ascents of James years ago because I thought that was very interesting. There is a scholarly book, and then there's my book, just making general information available. But that's only... The Ascents of James is only in the Recognitions of Clement. It's not in the Clementine Homilies, surprisingly enough. But it's only a small section of it, just like 3 or 4 pages. So there's an Aramaic version of Clement. So this man named Stanley, he has the Syriac Pseudo-Clementines. The shocking thing, it's just a paperback book, like a paperback novel, but it costs upwards of $80 plus. I don't know why the book is so expensive, but it is. So this is what's called an epitome. What is an epitome? Epitome is a condensed book, right? I guess an example would be Second Maccabees, right? So Second Maccabees, Second Maccabees says, I'm going to abridge Jason of Cyrene's 5-volume account of the Maccabees. We don't have Jason of Cyrene's 5-volume retelling the Maccabees story. All we have is Second Maccabees, a condensed version of that work, which would be considered an epitome, right? So we don't have the original Journeys of Peter anymore. We do have the Recognitions of Clement. We have the Homilies of Clement. But this is an epitome, which is kind of in a condensed version, but it's based not just exclusively on the recognitions. Whoever produced this condensed book, which is called an epitome. When you think epitome is like an ultimate example, but it's got two meanings. One is an ultimate example, the epitome of virtue, whatnot. But another meaning of the word epitome is a condensed book or a retelling. I've talked about this before. It's just like you have Hesiod's theogony about the stories of the gods, and you have like Bulfinch's mythology, which is a retelling. So that'd be kind of an epitome of sorts, I guess. Or Edith Hamilton's Greek myths, right? She's taking the stories from Hesiod's theogony, and it's an epitome. That's what an epitome is. So this Aramaic book, the Syriac Pseudo-Clementines, is a condensed book, but it's not just derived from taking information from both versions, right? So this is readable. So instead of looking at this gigantic tome and it's like, oh my goodness, I mean, how many people actually read something like Gone with the Wind, for that matter, or a book like Grapes of Wrath, or this is a shorter book that's more accessible, but something like The Stand or War and Peace. It's a big book. It's a challenge to read something that massive. So the Clementine literature is a massive book. Especially when you read, like I've read both back to back. So I got the early church fathers set, and the Clementine literature is in one volume with the recognition and then the homilies. And I think you can get a version. It's a challenging read. You have to be committed to do it. Someone needs to actually condense these books to make it more accessible to the general reading public. So, but Stanley's version, but you have to understand that this is it's not a proper condensed version of the book. I mean, it gives you the overview of it, but you have a series of debates and teachings that it's not complete. And it's not derived from one or the other, it's a combination of both. This is this book, I think, is accessible to the general reading public. And it just has a good introduction to it, and it's written in modern English, not like this translation I have from the mid-1800s, which is it's fine, in my opinion, but it is a little bit of a challenging read. So this is the way to... Now, there's another book, I haven't gotten a copy of this. It's called The Sorrows of Matidia. So you have kind of it's not really a frame story. Stanley calls this book the earliest Christian novel, right? So basically you have this kind of a family drama, Clement's family, where the whole family's separated, there's these shipwrecks, people get lost, all the family members are separate, they don't even know where the other ones are, they're looking for us. This is family tragedy. Born into wealth and privilege, and the family's just meets disaster, but then they're reunited at the end of the story. So it's this kind of soap opera type, drama. And all this didactic teaching material is inserted in the story. So it does have an overarching plot, but it's got a lot of debates and dialogues in the course of the story. Probably with the Sorrows of Matilda, this is Matidia. The author is not focusing so much on the debates and dialogue and instructional section are very interesting and very important. But I need to get a copy of that because this since it's such a massive tome, it's not accessible to the general reading public, and it's important. It's an important piece of literature. So this book by Stanley does make it accessible, and then we have this other version. And there are some other books out there. You have the books on the book on the Ascents of James. There's other books I haven't gotten yet that are research and scholars looking at various aspects of Clementine literature and the beliefs and practices of the ancient Jewish Christian sect, the Ebionites, that produced this literature. Someone was saying, I think that I read that, so when Constantine, he converts to Christianity, right? And he starts promoting Christianity in the Roman Empire. That's when, taking this older information, literature, over 100 years old, 50, 60 years old, the author of the Journeys of Peter, what he's trying to do is I want to express our version of Christianity in the face of this alternate church, which professes to be the true and authentic Jewish Christian church established by Jesus Christ and the apostles themselves. So the person who wrote the Journeys of Peter is a very learned man and a deep thinker, actually. And I think that one of the aspects of this literature is I think it's very useful in apologetics. I was talking this morning in my message how we had Wes Huff. Wes Huff is a Canadian Bible scholar. And there is, let me see if I can find this guy's name. I don't know why I keep on forgetting it. Billy Carson. That's it. So Billy Carson's going around making all these extravagant claims. Because he's not really he's self-educated, but in a bad way. He's amateur, right? But he's very forceful, and he says, "I know the truth about the original meaning of the Bible and the alternate scriptures, like all these apocryphal texts. The church has got it wrong, and they're understanding the Bible is wrong." So he's making all these sensational claims. Billy Carson is about ancient authentic knowledge, from esoteric knowledge from ancient Egypt, from Africa. Billy Carson's making all these claims that the original Bible has changed, and he understands what the Bible really was. So he's on some kind of podcast, and someone asked Wes Huff to come. Wes Huff is a Bible teacher, Bible scholar, theologian, trained theologian. And he decimates Billy Carson. It's humiliating for Billy Carson. Billy Carson's whole life and work is just destroyed in one debate. Showed him as a fraud and as an ignorant person, it comes down to ill-educated, misinforming people. So the interesting thing is Wes Huff, once he decimated, destroyed Billy Carson, and Billy Carson deserved it because he's kind of aggressive towards, doesn't know what he's talking about, doesn't have an education, and yet he's attacking Christianity, attacking the church relentlessly. So he finally meets head-to-head with a trained Bible scholar, conservative Bible-believing Bible scholar, destroyed. So then they go to Wes Huff and it's like, hey, you need to, all these Muslims want to debate him, the atheists want to debate him, all these weird cults want to debate him, and Wes Huff's like, look, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to debate you. I'm just not going to do it. I might, if the Lord compels me, or that I should do this, or if there's a overriding reason, but I'm not just going to go around debating. But we need people to do that. We need debaters, and David Wood. Not only people engaging in debates, I believe there's a place for polemics, like David Wood, debate and polemics, and the early church fathers did it, and it's important. Sometimes there's scorners or scoffers, there's blasphemers. But then people have legitimate questions. Like people could see Billy Carson, for instance, and maybe they're taken in by him. Maybe they don't understand why should they believe in the Bible. What is the evidence? Is there manuscript or archaeological, historical evidence to verify the claims of the Bible? Right? Or you have, for instance, you have Islam. Islam making claims like Jesus was never crucified. So, do we understand Jesus from the Quran? Is that the proper way to understand Jesus? Or, was Jesus crucified or not? Why do we believe Jesus was crucified? What's an accurate representation of who the historic Jesus was? The first century accounts in the four Gospels, or the 7th century account attributed to Muhammad? Or actually, the Quran's probably evolved into the form we know it today in the 8th century. So, there's a billion Muslims. They're going around attacking and ridiculing the scriptures on the basis of the claims of their prophet. We have to defend the faith. So, apologetics is important. Not everybody's called to do it. Wes Huff is like, I'm a professor, I'm a Bible teacher, I'm a Bible scholar. I'm not a debater, That's fine, but we need people to engage in debates. We need to have people, Christians, engaging in apologetics. And probably Wes Huff is doing apologetics in a different format besides debate, but there's a place for debate. So you could say that this Clementine literature is ancient apologetics from a Jewish Christian perspective. Like I said, Recognitions of Clement is this book, the Syriac Clementine, Pseudo-Clementine Homilies by Stanley. I don't think there's any that I remember false doctrines or heresies in that. There's not any heresies or false doctrines in the Recognitions of Clement. There are some in the Clementine Homilies, where it's one of the things the Ebionite Christian says that's true is we see this in the Ascents of James, and this seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you think about it, they're right. And during the debates, and the temple debate in the Ascents of James, you have the idea, it's like, well, Jesus came and fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. And the apostle says, okay, that's true. We believe the prophecies. We believe that Jesus fulfilled them. But we don't believe in the prophecies. Jesus takes priority of the Old Testament, right? Since Jesus acknowledged the prophecies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, we accept it because our prophet of God that we acknowledge as the true prophet, he acknowledged the Old Testament scriptures, and therefore we accept it. He has priority and precedence over the Old Testament scriptures. And it's like, oh, well, that's a pretty bold claim, but it's true. It's true. That's the proper way of looking at it. Jesus takes precedence as the Messiah, as God's true prophet. And like I said, he affirmed the reliability of the scriptures. He affirmed the reliability of the scriptures, and the Ebionite Christians affirmed the reliability of the scriptures for the most part. But they thought that certain sections of the Torah, for instance, at least in the homilies, were not inerrant. And the proper way to understand the Old Testament was through the interpretation of Jesus as they understood it. So it's a very interesting, significant book. And if you want to understand, if you want to study early Jewish Christianity, why don't you go back to the text that they wrote. In conclusion, I also want to talk about the Quattrodecimans. Quattrodecimans. These were early Christians, Jewish Christians, that celebrated the resurrection, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus on the Jewish Passover, Quattrodeciman. And their contention was, we observe the Passover, the Jewish Passover, because John and Philip and the apostles that founded our communities taught us to celebrate the Jewish Passover in this way. And we have a Passover Haggadah of sorts, a Passover Seder, written by a Jewish Christian called Melito of Sardis, and the Passover Homily, which apparently gives us insight to how early Jewish Christians observed the Passover. It's called Peri-Pascha, or on the Passover. And this Jewish Christian is rebuking his fellow Jews for rejecting their Messiah. And he uses strong words. People are like, oh my goodness, this seems anti-Semitic, but you have to understand what it is. Now, this is a Jewish Christian Passover Haggadah that survived from the same time. This is the year 150, 160 is when Peri-Pascha was written. So, I'm just saying that when we study the Jewish roots of the faith, It's time to look at it from a different perspective. Let's go back and try to learn what we can of the original Jewish Christians and how they practiced the faith. Instead of adapting rabbinic Judaism for our purposes, why don't we consult the original Jewish Christians and their point of view, their perspective on how they practiced the faith. I'm not saying they're right about everything. I don't necessarily agree with everything they said. I just think this is very, very important for understanding early Jewish Christianity. You have a large book that's an expression that's written by expressing their beliefs and practices, written by a Jewish Christian, using material perhaps as potentially writings and traditions from the late 1st century and the early to mid 2nd century for this important literature, just perspective on early Jewish Christianity. So I think it's important to try to make this literature accessible to the people who are interested in this subject. And, a lot of people aren't aware of the Clementine Homilies and Recognitions and their significance. So I'm going to be teaching about this more in the future.